All right. So Myles Kennedy, one of my early wish list dream guests when I came up with this concept. It's interesting because I did another interview earlier today with a filmmaker, and we were talking about, the famous Alfred Hitchcock series of interviews where he did the deep dive on his entire filmography. And that's really, a less sophisticated way what I'm aiming to do with this disc dive series, where I'd sit with an artist like yourself who has a discography worth exploring, and we do studio album by studio album. And
right on.
The whole thing. And I've been, for the most part, skipping EPs and live albums just for the sake of sanity.
Right.
and time, obviously.
Right.
But in some records it's a minute or two of conversation. Some records it's a lot longer, and just kind of depends where the conversation takes us.
Cool.
So I would love to begin with something I very likely don't know. Prior to Cosmic Dust, even, was there an earlier, what was your first experience in a recording studio, whether or not it resulted in an official release or not? When was the first time you were like, I'm making music and I'm in a studio and it's legit?
Well, believe it or not, that would be, if I'm not mistaken, coming up on 33 years ago. So I was a kid, and we had this band called Bittersweet, and we were kind of, part of what was going. We were into a lot of what was happening at the time in the mid to late 80s, and so we did our first recording. We recorded 2 songs, and it was in the summer of '87, if I'm not mistaken. We had a song called "Lonely Nights" and a song called "We Stand Together." And
very much of the era.
It was full on, but it was cool. It was like, and the guy who recorded us, he understood we were just these kids, and we were all just excited to be in there. And it ended up being a very cool experience, and kind of a precursor to what I would spend my life doing,
Yeah. And were you playing guitar and singing, or just guitar or just singing, or what did you do in that band?
I was just playing guitar. So we had a singer. His name is Jason Stewart, and the drummer. And interestingly enough, Z.U. Dean, he's the drummer who who's on the most recent solo record I just finished, and also the first solo record. Just an old friend, amazing, crazy good drummer. But that was. So I was just playing the guitar, and it was fun. So,
and he's played with you, and I mean we'll be hearing about him again here in just a couple of records, right? Didn't he play in another band coming up? But yeah, let's talk about the first thing that I have, and this is also an opportunity to correct the record, no pun intended, if any of this is wrong. But the Cosmic Dust album, Journey, would that be your first full-length album?
Does it say anywhere where like the date that was recorded? I want to say it was like 90.
It says 91 is what
91. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that would have been the first official recording. And what's interesting is that was recorded in a weekend. It was done at the community college where I met these guys were all my teachers basically. And
these were like jazz fusion guys, right?
Yeah. They were really talented jazz fusion guys, and for some reason they thought it would be a good idea to bring in this idiot student to play guitar, and so I was just there's one of those things where I'm hanging on for dear life. These are guys who are twice my age, have tons of experience, and we're suddenly in a recording studio, and it's recording live. This was before Pro Tools or anything, so it's basically and it's improvisation. So you go through, which is talk about a daunting task, Yeah. Talk about red light phobia, but what's fascinating about that record is that so many people have discovered it, and it was just kind of this one weekend thing. I kind of forgot about it, and so little was put into it, in terms of, production and all. They was just like, here, everybody set up in your location, and we'll start recording, and then go home, and that's it.
Yeah, and of course there's a certain magic to that, right? Like an old punk 7-inch, or this stuff where there's a kind of a brilliance in restriction. Like when you think about John Carpenter's original Halloween, he's got like 2 weeks in Pasadena with no money and no name actors, versus like a Halloween film that gets made decades later with a multi-million-dollar budget. And it's like, and yet somehow there's something more magical and pure about that first one. And it's
Absolutely.
like, even though he didn't have the resources to do everything he thought he wanted to, having those restrictions ended up making something cooler.
It's interesting how that works, right? With records, that seems to be a thing. I didn't realize that about. My wife and I just watched that like 2 weeks ago.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I just love that era, and it's interesting hearing that information. I didn't realize that, but it makes sense. It has that quality. It's like you're capturing lightning in a bottle for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You're not overthinking it, and you don't have all this money to make it too slick. And I think that happens with recordings. And I think that that's why a lot of the records we love from, the 60s and 70s, there's a certain thing because they weren't overthinking it.
Yeah, there's imperfections, and there's, the tempo's off, or, there's no grid to lock everything into. Right. Yeah, the original Halloween, it's supposed, takes place in Haddonfield. But there are palm trees visible a couple of times.
Right.
It's like, there were no digital painters to go in and clean that up. But it's part of the beauty of it. As a nerd, I like nerding out on those little imperfections, or you can see I was watching a YouTube video the other day about these old Star Trek episodes, and even the Next Generation, that when they started coming out on Blu-ray, they weren't filmed with that kind of crystal clear clarity and giant TVs in mind. So suddenly you can see like nails in parts of the sets, and boom mics reflecting in a corner somewhere. And but it's part of the charm, magic with some of this. So this brings us into like a full-on band, Citizen Swing, and we got a couple records from Citizen Swing. What can you tell me about that, the formation of that band, and and stepping up as a front man, and the role that Citizen Swing played in your eventual evolution that got you to where you are now?
What's interesting about that is that was born out of me doing session work. I never intended, well, I won't say I never intended. As a young person, sure, you fantasize about making records and being, a recording artist, but it just seems so out of reach for somebody where I lived here in Spokane. And so I was doing a session because that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach, and I wanted to be a session guitar player during the day. I mean, just kind of somehow schedule it all together. And I did a session with a gentleman who was actually Dionne Warwick's like musical director, who just so happened to live here. His name was Joe Close, an amazing, really talented, like had jazz chops, and he was the real deal. And a lot of people really looked up to him around the community. And then a woman named Carolyn Lawson, who they had done some things together, and
he wasn't one of her psychic friends, was he?
No, I don't know what the exact connection
my Generation
was, but
X is showing right now. Sorry, continue.
But I get a call from them a few weeks after the session. They're like, "Hey, we were thinking we really like working with you. Would you be interested in maybe like trying to make a record?" And to make a long story short, they were the people who planted the seed. Like, have you ever thought of like singing and writing and making records? And I was like, that seems really unrealistic. And somehow they were able to finagle this deal, like for this. It was training wheels for as far as a record deal goes, but it facilitated making this record. And what you hear there on that first Citizen Swing record is somebody who was just learning how to write songs. It was essentially documenting some of the very first full-on songs that I was part of writing, and the lyrics on that first record, those were her lyrics. So that was the deal. I'd write the music and come up with the melodies, and she'd write the lyrics. So it was a very interesting period, but it then evolved into the next record where it was actually a band by the point. It wasn't like a solo artist, and then it was the many different dynamics that happen when you start playing with an actual band, so it was fun.
And that happens even later when you think about, like, the Foo Fighters, like that first record's just Dave Grohl, and then eventually becomes a band, or as we will of course get to, the Conspirators in a bit. How do you feel when you hear Citizen Swing now, or when's the last time that happened, that you had occasion to, like, I'm going to listen to that, or someone was listening, making you listen to it, or whatever the case may be?
I generally don't go back and listen to anything that I do, because I'll pick it apart. But I do remember it came on like Shuffle or something years ago.
That's usually what'll get you.
Yeah, that's what'll get that damn Shuffle, and then it ruins my day. But yeah, it was one of those things where when I heard it, I kind of chuckled, just because first I had no idea artistically what I was doing, and I hadn't really established. I knew what I didn't want to do, and that's the one thing I do respect about that period. Just over the hill in Seattle, things were starting to happen. I think we started recording that probably in late 91, 92, and we knew about Soundgarden, we knew about Alice in Chains. At that point, we didn't know just how big it was going to get.
Sure.
And the one thing that I told myself is, like, they have their scene. I'm going to try and do something totally different. And I was listening at that point. I was listening to a lot of Stevie Wonder, Sly and the Family Stone. I was playing in cover bands as well, and it was basically an R&B cover band. So a lot of that was influencing me, and so that's where I drew from musically. But it was interesting, because I remember when we came out in this part of the world, there were people who liked it, who were like, "Oh, it's different," but then there were people who just hated it, because, like, what are they doing? It's like this funky, what they didn't know what it was. It's not tuned down, it's not grungy, and he's not screaming, and so yeah, it was an interesting.
Why isn't this guy more depressed?
Yeah, exactly. And why do we hear trumpets?
Yeah, but there is something to be said too for the idea of knowing what you don't want to do. And if you think about, there are movements in art, film, literature, that are defined by its opposition, of, like, okay, and not to say that you were confronting what was happening there, but that you saw what was going on nearby, and said, okay, I'm going to consciously steer away and do something else. There's something to be said for that, for sure. And like you said, the training wheels of an early record deal, but that's an important step too, right? Is at the time, of course, you don't have any concept or context for what those will be like later in life. So in that moment, you're like, I have a record deal, right? I'm signed to a record label. This is crazy. Like, that had to have been its own milestone, right?
Yeah, you know what, Ryan, I consider myself really lucky that happened, because what it afforded me the luxury of was refining the vision. It got me, those training wheels got me on the bike, and it sent me down the road. And I made a lot of mistakes. Frankly, for a long, long time, I still didn't really know what I was artistically. I would kind of go through phases where I'd start listening to one guy and then absorb too much of it, and I had to learn. It was an education, but I'm really grateful that I had an education with some small record label helping out and helping.
Yeah, and having some people around you and getting to play in different genres. And yeah, as you said, it's interesting. I hear stories of comedians as they're building their act and finding what their persona is, and you'll hear them talk about how their early shows, they were just doing George Carlin, or they were just doing Pryor. They didn't realize even how much, and then they start to kind of find themselves. And I think that it's a great advantage for you, and I think this will become clear as we keep going forward in your discography. You had an opportunity to make mistakes and to play with different people and to have different business deals and to, write different kinds of songs and different genres a little bit out of the spotlight versus some of these cats you think about where they have a platinum record right out of the gate and they're 19 and then they're defined by that one record for the rest of their life and they're either trying to chase it or get away from it or they're the sophomore slump, right? Like you're watching everybody go through their growing pains on the most massive scale. I think it's pretty cool the route that you took and similar artists when they go on this path where you got to really develop and find yourself, organically and mental growth.
Absolutely. I'm really, I can't emphasize how grateful I am that it worked out that way. Because I see these young artists occasionally who'll come out and it's just a rocket ship and it just takes off. And I'm like, man, I hope they're ready for this. I hope that this is really who they want to be, because this is what their brand is now.
Yes.
And I think that for me personally, I am in every way a late bloomer. I was a late bloomer from a biological standpoint. When I was 16, 17, I still looked like, I had barely hit puberty yet. So it was kind of the same thing for me creatively, where it just took a long time to bloom and figure out where I belonged.
Yeah, I think that's cool.